A lot of what you're talking about, you wrote about this in your book on national populism. A lot of this stuff was somewhat obvious back in 2016 for anyone who took the time for some self-reflection to try and understand the political movements at play then. So how is it that 8 years later, we're still not, or rather, the establishment elite are still contending with this movement? Wouldn't it be as simple as listening to ordinary people, listening to working people as to what it is they care about? How are we still in the, how has this populist age not been nipped in the bud?
Elites don't want to listen. We're nearly 10 years on from 2016. There has been no meaningful, serious attempt to respond to the grievances that voters put on the table, not just in 2016, but through the early 2010s and through the 2000s, when the likes of Marine Le Pen and Nigel Farage were first on the rise. There has been no serious response to the request for...
The response is, what I've just said in this conversation, is that they just smear it all as far right instead of engaging with
There's
it.
been no response to the request for less immigration. There's been no response to the request for slower demographic and population change. There's been no request to...
Well, the response is that it's all been worse.
There's been no response to the request to push back hard against woke ideologies that basically undermine our history, our values, and who we are. And there has been a consistent attempt from the aftermath of Donald Trump to Brexit to Europe, as you know, through your debate at the Oxford Union with Nancy Pelosi, has been an attempt to denigrate populist voters as extremists, fascists, anti-democrats. I mean, the insurrection stuff in the US in the aftermath of the January riot, I thought was emblematic of this, much in the same way as the response to Brexit here was, which is fundamentally, for a radicalized liberal elite class that really now believes it's under siege on all fronts, that really genuinely believes it's living through the reincarnation of the Third Reich, that believes the fascists are at the gates. Number one tells us how isolated and detached that elite class has become from everybody else in society, how little interaction they're having with everybody else in society. Because if they were going to places like Clacton in England, where Nigel Farage is running, or they were spending genuine amounts of time in the Midwest and actually sitting in these communities, it'd become pretty bloody obvious very quickly that they're not living through those things. But we've seen them radicalize over the last 10, 20 years, where they now genuinely believe that the movements they are facing are anti-democratic, fascist, revolutionary movements, when in reality, in most of the cases, they're actually movements that just have a different view as to what the consensus should be in our societies. They don't agree with mass immigration. Most of them say we'll have some immigration, we don't want mass immigration. They say it's important to protect who we are. We don't just want to erode that by clinging to these universal liberal themes that don't really mean anything. They want to put the voice and the values of ordinary people into the political debate. The elites don't want to do that. They're used to having power. They've consolidated their power. They don't want to give up their power. So they dominate not just politics, but the media class, the creative class, the cultural class. They just don't, ultimately, they don't want to give up power.
So I would actually... this is some insight I got from my experience with Pelosi, but I think you mentioned Tony Blair, and I think it applies to a lot of these globalist elites, is that for them to actually have the self-reflection and see why is it that these movements are going away from their own worldview would be to have to address what they themselves had done as politicians, as elites, but also it would mean to almost to deconstruct their entire worldview, which would be a psychologically painful experience for them. So on a personal, individual level, there's not the incentive for them to do that, to deal with the fact that maybe their entire career had done serious damage to the world.
I think you're spot on, but I think also I'd go further. I'd say for people on the liberal progressive left, we're not talking about a rational interpretation of a political ideology. We are talking about a religion. They view their project as a religion. So when I talk to them, I've briefed Labour leaders on Nigel Farage's support. I remember in 2015 saying to Ed Miliband and Labour, if you don't get on this, actually 2013, if you don't get on this, if you don't actually address the concerns of your voters, this populist revolt is going to become enormous. And what happened? Brexit, Farage, and now here we are again with Farage breaking through. Why? They didn't listen. Because every time I said, You do understand most people don't want mass migration. You do understand most people want to feel proud of where they come from. You do understand that most people don't want to see their identity and their history and their values just maligned and thrown to one side by this woke ideology stuff that says actually you should be more ashamed than proud of who you are. They just kind of glaze over. It's the righteous mind stuff that people like John Haidt talked about. They just cannot relate to the fact that for many people out there, group loyalty, group identity, a sense of respect for the national community and for the boundaries that make us who we are, liberals just really struggle to relate to that. And just one last point, because this is really, I think this is really important about this discussion about elites. If you look at who has made these decisions, mass migration, globalization, often they are people who derive their legitimacy and their esteem and their status not from their relationship with the voters below, but from their relationship with other elites. And just very briefly, for viewers internationally, why this is important, why is Rishi Sunak in such trouble in Britain? Why is he leading the Conservative Party into the abyss? One thing happened during this campaign that was very revealing. He went to the D-Day 80th anniversary in France, and he left early, because he thought it was more important to come back and try and campaign to hold on to his power than actually celebrate and mark the sacrifices that our ancestors had made on the beaches of France to liberate Europe. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us, firstly, on the surface, that Rishi Sunak has got terrible advisors and his instincts are off. Okay, but that's not actually the story. The story is it confirms to millions of voters that he is part of an elite that actually is more interested in cementing their position as part of that global elite than protecting and promoting what it is that gives us a distinctive sense of identity, history, and collective memory. He is like Nick Clegg, who could not wait to leave the UK and go and work for Facebook. He's like Tony Blair, who could not wait to basically create a global consultancy doing all kinds of dodgy deals with dodgy dictators. He's like this global elite class that is now, as Chris Lash once said in The Revolt of the Elites in 1993, which is a phenomenal book. He wrote it on his deathbed. He saw all of this coming. He said, the thing is, it's not that they're not interested in the fellow members of their national community, it's that they don't like them anymore. They actively disdain members of their national community. They view them as low status. I sit in meetings with senior Tories in Britain all the time. They view the debates that we're talking about, immigration, radical Islam, what's happening to our cultural values, these are low status issues for them. They don't want to talk about that because it threatens their sense of esteem, their sense of recognition, their sense of moral righteousness among other members of the elite class. And once you understand that's how they see the world, everything just makes a lot more sense. And that's why these populists are doing so well. They're stepping into the vacuum that's been left by an elite class that is no longer interested in serving and representing and respecting fellow members of their national community.
Let's just talk about that vacuum, because it seemed to me, particularly after Boris won the election here, even though he was up against a left-wing populist under Corbyn in 2019, that and after Brexit, that there was a move from the Conservatives away from technocracy that we'd experienced under Cameron and his coalition with Clegg, as well as, the 1 year when the Conservatives had a majority. Then we have this move back to Rishi, which seemed like a reversion to that technocracy. He put Cameron in as foreign secretary. It was like they had not learnt any of the lessons from the last 8 years. It seems so blatantly obvious, and it's almost like every decision Rishi makes, it's a continuation of that. There's no self-reflection there.
It's entirely predictable. One of the books that had an influence on me, written in 2000, was Post-Democracy by an academic called Colin Crouch. And he said basically what's happening is the heart and soul of democracies are getting torn out. They're getting eroded. They're getting hollowed out through the rise of spin doctors, focus groups, opinion polling, technocratic advisors, institutions like the European Union. Peter Mayer, another very famous academic, wrote another great book called Ruling the Void, in which he said the problem within the European project is actually not the rise of populism per se, but is this enormous gulf that now separates a technocratic class of elites from ordinary people. And whereas once upon a time you had the golden age of representative democracy, where people would go out and meet voters, elites would go and meet voters, they would campaign with voters. The only person who's doing that in British politics today is Nigel Farage. When I was in Clacton with him, walking down streets...
Galloway's doing it.
George Galloway's doing it. Rishi Sunak isn't doing it. Keir Starmer isn't doing it. It's all stage managed. It's a warehouse on the outskirts of a town where you bus in your activists, you bus in your loyalists, you make it look like you're with the people, but you're not with the people. Where are you? You are in post-democracy. So if you want to understand why populists are cutting through, it's not just because they're talking about these issues. It's because they're actually doing democracy. They are with the demos. They are with the people. Now, unless mainstream parties can get back to doing that, I think they're going to continuously struggle to actually reconnect with voters, because we're not, the thing that the most striking aspect about populism for me now is not just how well they're doing at elections, but just how many young people who have no memory at all of what politics used to be like are voting for them. They have no memory at all of the 60s and the 70s and the 80s when my dad would vote Labour and his dad would vote Labour. All that stuff's gone. Tribal allegiances are gone. So you've got a new generation now who actually like these parties because they're better at social media, they're knocking on your doors, and they're talking about stuff that actually is quite important, like the rise of trans ideology, radical Islam, migration, stuff that people want to talk about. So the elites are not only not talking about those issues, they're not even talking to ordinary people about those issues. And that is where you get this enormous vacuum for Farage, for Le Pen, for Maloney, and so on.